Hey, I'm wearing a different one of my Math League shirts today. I'm going to try and go through all of them throughout these videos, but I'm not doing math today or anything like that. However, 2 days ago you saw me do those nerdity tests, and tonight I'm going to do a similar thing and go through a couple of the online autism tests. I'm not trying to equate autism with nerdiness, even though I am both nerdy and autistic. That obviously doesn't apply to everyone. I know tons of nerdy people on the internet who are clearly not autistic, and I probably know some autistic people who aren't nerdy. Those are two things that stereotypically go together because they both involve lack of social skills, but it's obviously not universal in any way. I mean, you can be more naturally unable to be social, or it can be something like a choice. And I don't think I don't think it was a choice for me, but um and this of course is going to be my most awkward of all the videos, fittingly, but there does seem to be a now stereotypical correlation between what we think of as nerdiness and what we think of as Asperger's, because Asperger's is almost defined to exclude people with extremely low IQs. So people who don't have low IQs and lack social skills and obsess over things often tend to be nerds, but it's not universal. So by doing this right after the other video, I'm not trying to equate the two. Just because they both apply to me doesn't mean they universally apply, because of course they don't. There's just a correlation similar to how autism is correlated with ADHD and OCD and all sorts of other things that, I mean, the one doesn't cause the other. So I wanted to be sensitive here when doing this, but um I mentioned previously somewhere in the King of the Numbers video where I broke Michael Shestov's record that I wanted to, at some point, I mean after the book is done and maybe after the next book I'm planning after that, I'm planning on doing a couple of books on my auto racing statistical research too. But or maybe coinciding with some of that, but almost certainly after the typing book, I want to do some advocacy for autistics. I've decided that I was not properly diagnosed when I was a kid, because I came of age when I was 4 or 5 years old. That's when I was being entered into the school system. This was 1989 or 1990. This is almost immediately after the movie Rain Man came out. The Raymond Babbitt character in that movie was defined as supposedly a high functioning autistic. That created the false impression, or at least false impression by today's standards, that high functioning autistics were at the level of institutionalization. Now, Lorna Wing, who came up with the autism spectrum by merging Leo Kanner's autism theory with Hans Asperger's theory. She merged them into one and came up with the autism spectrum. Although that technically already existed, By the time of Rain Man, it was not really known by the public at all until maybe the turn of the millennium. Maybe some really well-connected people heard about it in the 90s, but when I entered grade school, I had 2400 vision. I had a speech impediment. Like I would say words like closer, I would pronounce it as quosa or something sort of like that. My mom was disabled with multiple sclerosis, so I was a homebody, and and she was having a really bad time then because she was having seizures and stuff too, dozens or hundreds of times a day. It eventually entirely healed, which was great, although her MS still didn't heal. So I spent a lot of time by myself. That's how I became such a great typist because I mean I was just at times raising myself when my mom didn't have the energy because she was having dozens or hundreds of seizures and was totally bedridden. So I would just go off in a daze in my own world for many hours a day playing with calculators or playing on the computer or typing or whatever. And that's how I managed to teach myself to type when I was 3 years old or something before I was even potty trained, I believe. But I had so many issues. I had never really socialized with anyone entering grade school. I had never done any sort of sports or exercise to begin with. So when I started in kindergarten, I was placed in every single special ed course that the elementary school offered, and I was labeled as multiply handicapped. I was not labeled as autistic because that wasn't considered autistic at the time because I wasn't at the level of institutionalization like Raymond Babbitt. However, I was in occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, um, resource, counseling, adaptive physical education, and for most of elementary school, I rode a special school bus. I was mainstreamed after that in 5th and 6th grade, and after that, I only had counseling for a few years, and then it was fully mainstreamed after that. But I was labeled as multiply handicapped, but nobody knew what it was. They tried to test me for ADHD once. It was just listed as hyperactivity at the time. Hyperactivity and ADD used to be separate diagnoses in the 90s, I believe, before they eventually were merged as ADHD. But I was tested for that and I was not. But it wasn't until like my senior year of high school when somebody thought I might possibly be autistic. It was my AP English teacher in my senior year of high school. He suggested I might be Asperger's. I found that um, geek syndrome quiz on the internet and I scored highly on it, but I didn't think much of it. And then when I went to Cornell freshmen in the College of Arts and Sciences where I was are required to take for 2 freshman writing seminars a year, which are, well, they can be pretty fun electives. The very first course I had at Cornell was a course called um, The Anthropology of Imaginary Subcultures, I believe it was. We talked about the the Star Trek people, the SCA, and comic book fandoms. It was an early course on fandom, and considering this was 2003, this was probably ahead of the curve as far as that did, and we were assigned to write papers on every so often to give us practice writing on all sorts of topics. Now, I wasn't much into any of those topics, but I mean, I was still that sort of person temperamentally, so I got into it. And the professor let me write my final essay about Tournament Scrabble, which I viewed to be in the same vein. This was before I was a Tournament Scrabble player, but I was already in the Scrabble by Mail group. Anyway, the other writing seminar I took was some history of the family or something. I don't really remember it. I do still own the textbook from it, however. Um, but my professor for that course, she told me that her daughter had Asperger's, and a lot of what I described in one of my essays reminded her of that. So a couple of teachers had talked about this independently, but I dawdled around and didn't get diagnosed because I didn't really believe it, or I thought honestly there were a lot of people who were in my boat who had some level of social ineptitude, but they could deal with it, and it wasn't really affecting their lives. They didn't need to get diagnosed. There were a lot of people, because the diagnosis for autism was a lot more strict in the 80s and 90s than it is today, who ended up falling through the cracks. And then I went to grad school, and I was unable to find a job immediately outside of grad school, and my career counselor suggested that I get an Asperger's diagnosis to try and make it easier for me to get a job, because she told me that I was one of the 10 most socially inept students she had ever counseled, which I took great offense to at the time. And I just immediately broke off contact with her, and that was one of a number of things that I feel probably contributed to ruining me career-wise, especially as we were right entering the Great Recession at that point. But I was convinced that basically almost anybody going for the same sorts of jobs I was would have a similar degree of nerdiness and social ineptitude, and would probably also qualify for a diagnosis, and I felt it would be unfair somehow if I chose to do that and got it over somebody else who had similar issues but didn't choose to get a diagnosis. And that was, in retrospect, a really dumb reason. And in retrospect, I can see that although maybe most of the Cornell campus and most of my classmates were equally nerdy, maybe most of them weren't as socially awkward, I don't know, but I definitely did not fit in at Cornell. Strangely, in high school, I kind of did, because people liked to follow me around and ask me arithmetic questions in the halls for some reason, and people enjoyed watching me type. These were like freakish talents, but I was sort of like a magician or a clown to them, and although some people made fun of me for sure, there I did have some weird cult fan base, just like what I now seem to have going global, and I found it just as weird then as I do now. Um, but eventually, after years of unemployment and underemployment, I finally gave in. It was long after the Ultimate Typing Championship. It was 2014. I finally got an Asperger's diagnosis. I did have it, and all those forms I had when I was a kid indicating my participation in all the special ed classes and stuff like that, those were important evidence to support my diagnosis. That had been something going on all along that just hadn't been properly diagnosed, because back in the 90s it wasn't considered autism, but now it is. So I spent way too long trying to get the diagnoses. But when I did my research on this, I found some depressing stuff, to be honest. I read that 95% of people with low functioning autism, and even 80% of people with Asperger's, are unemployed at any given time. Even like when the economy is doing well, like 2 months ago as opposed to now. even people with Asperger's, just high functioning autism, lower level autism, still are almost entirely unemployed. That seems like it's higher than I feel like it should be from the people with Asperger's that I do know. I think they are doing better than that, but I do also know a bunch who do meet those criteria and also collect disability. I wasn't at the level of being disabled technically for that, but I was unemployed a lot and for years. I mean, it was that period from 2009 to 2011 where I went from being basically, even with Jelani Nelson, to being dominant on all the online typing sites. I pushed hard at that in those years because I had almost nothing else to sustain me except for my auto racing statistics site, racedatabase.com. That was kind of it, as I kept getting rejected for jobs. I was setting these typing records and nobody cared. Didn't help me get typing jobs either. Applied for a bunch of civil service typing jobs, and despite my very fast speeds and doing extremely well in the exams, since they were just data entry, computation, sorting strings of letters sorts of things, which are all things I'm great at, but I mean, I was still too socially enough to be hireable for quite some time. And I think there are a lot of other people, especially millennials, probably not so much Zoomers, probably most Zoomers were diagnosed properly, but I think there might be a lot of other millennials who have had trouble, and maybe having even more trouble now that we're entering the worst recession, or if it's going to be a depression since the Great Depression. And I was astonished. It's one of the highest unemployment rates among any demographic. Even a lot of people with physical disabilities that are more obvious, I think have lower unemployment rates than that. And I think that's part of it because people with Asperger's especially, we don't look disabled, we just look weird, and people think we're weird as a result. I mean, just look at any of the comments those YouTube videos of the Ultimate Typing Championship got in 2011 and 2012. They were horrible. I think a lot of them kept me from getting jobs for a while. I mean, that was not the DOS keyboard people's fault that people were so sadistic there, and it wasn't their fault that, like, I was sticking my tongue out the whole time while I was typing and I didn't even notice. But I'm sure a bunch of employers did and went, ew. So I guess I wanted to do this especially so people could know where these resources exist if they feel like weird or they haven't fit in, and they weren't really considered severely autistic or anything, but they might still be, and that could be why they're having trouble getting jobs. Another scary statistic I read is that apparently autistic people commit suicide at a higher rate than any other demographic group except for the transgendered. That also scared me a lot when I read it. I mean, I have had anxiety and depression for decades. I was diagnosed for depression with anxiety features the same day I was diagnosed for Asperger's. And I mean, I've been depressed and I've never really been happy for a very long time. But the same seem to go for, to some degree, most of the people with Asperger's I know. And it seems to be more severe with people with Asperger's than lower functioning autistics, because people with Asperger's are more likely to know what they are missing. They're more likely to be aware of the world enough to know what they are missing. Well, it might be easier for somebody with lower functioning autism to be blissfully happy. Also, people with lower functioning autism are more obvious, and almost all of them will be considered eligibility, while a lot of people with Asperger's, or especially undiagnosed Asperger's, will just fall through the cracks because it's an invisible disability. So I think that very high unemployment rate, that astonishes me how high it was, and I still don't know whether I believe it, but that seems like it might be one of the main factors leading to the depression and suicide rates as well. So, and another thing is that I had a ton of resources when I was a child because the elementary schools had tons of great special ed resources. Even though the school district I went to was the biggest school district and tended to have the lowest test scores on average of any of the suburban Syracuse districts, it was still big enough. It was still a big enough framework to have a support network for people who fall through the cracks. Um, the U.S. still does care about disabled kids and disabled senior citizens, but for working age adults, there seems to be almost nothing because most people seem to have the attitude that if you don't have a job, you're not working hard enough and that sort of thing. So people do not really pity working age adults if they are disabled in a way that you can't really see. So that leads to misery for a lot of middle-aged autistics, and it might be even worse for millennials and Zoomers because of how many people in my generation, the millennials, weren't diagnosed because the diagnoses were a lot more strict back then. So, for all these reasons, I feel like disabled adults in general, disabled working age adults, especially people whose disabilities can't be seen and aren't really eligible for Social Security disability or anything like that, are one of the most underrepresented minorities out there, especially autistics. And I want to, at some point, if there's something I can do, use some of my fame to give back as far as that goes. I don't know what that would be yet, but it's been something I've been thinking about for a while, and I wanted to get that out there, I guess. Probably the biggest manifestation of my autism is my eating disorder, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. I'll talk about that later, probably not tonight, but I do have an eating disorder, and I have irritable bowel syndrome, and I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, but I'm not sure. All those things are linked with each other and linked with autism as well. One of the things I didn't realize was that autism actually had physical manifestations also, even at the Asperger's level. People with Asperger's tend to have gastric issues much more than the general population. We tend to have sensitivities to everything, like drug reactions. I reacted to almost every one of the antibiotics that my family doctor gave me when I was a kid. I reacted to every single one but one, got a rash or something. I had my eating disorder because the texture of all sorts of kinds of food I was unable to take. So I had one of the worst diets ever, certainly throughout my childhood, and I haven't much improved in adulthood. A little I have. And now there are like these meal replacement things that I've started drinking Soylent and stuff. But fluorescent lights bother me. Like when I'm in a grocery store and I'm surrounded by fluorescent lights, I have to wear some sort of sunglasses. I just recently bought some blue blocking glasses, and they do seem to be working fine for blocking the light. Sound can be a big trigger. I know when I was in elementary school, especially, and when I was in gym classes with other students, which I was sometimes, I was only in the special ed classes half the time and in the regular classes the other half. But whenever I was in a gym, the noise of people on the bleachers and talking, I almost always had to get away from people talking and would just walk to the other corner of the room. Um, that even happened when I was at a state math league meet, which should have been telling. Both of the years I was at state math league meets, especially the 11th grade year, um, one of those years was in Niskayuna, a suburb of Schenectady. The other year was in Webster, a suburb of Rochester. I don't remember which was which, but in the 11th grade year, while all the other kids were having lunch, I mean, this was the math nerds, the state level math nerds, including me. I just had to leave the room, and that should have been telling that maybe while everybody in that room was a nerd, I was the most autistic, but I didn't really think like that at that time. I had to leave the room because all the other kids were making so much noise. I mean, it didn't help that I was the only person from my high school, so I didn't have many people to talk to either, but so yeah, I have deep empathy about these issues, and there's a lot of stuff that's surprisingly underreported, especially the physical sensations people get. People know about, almost everybody knows about how autistic people struggle socially, but the physical manifestations I think are a lot less known, and the same thing about how high the unemployment and suicide rates are among people with autism, like higher than almost any other demographic group. That scared me to read, and I've known some autistic people who committed suicide. Avery Mojica, who was the third highest ranked Scrabble player in the nation last summer. I'll look up his cross tables page. He had won his last 9 tournaments before he died. He committed suicide last summer, and I mean, oh, it was his last 11 tournaments. It wasn't his last 9. Wow. And he had won 3 straight tournaments undefeated, but it didn't make him happy, and he killed himself in a car crash, and I wish there was something I could do. I mean, I saw some of his scary posts right before, but I think I might not have seen them until after he'd done it. And there was one of my fellow Ultimate Typing Championship contenders who made the semifinal round. Kevin Tejan, I believe it's pronounced Tejan, Tejan. He was from Arizona, so I'm assuming it's Spanish, like Texan in Spanish. Alright, I'm going to look for my live journal posts. I know that site is really, really old. Okay, here it is. I made a live journal post on January 17th, 2010, where I listed who had the 20 fastest speeds in the preliminary round of the Ultimate Typing Championship. A lot of them were disqualified because they were outside of the country. Cocaine tried to enter and would have made it. Yas Gritter tried to enter and would have made it, but neither of them were American, and Cocaine was under 18 years old, and Don Vu For You was apparently a cheater, from what I heard from Noah Horn, who was 5th. Benjamin Dickman was studying in China at the time, and they refused to fly him. So a lot of these people did not end up being eligible. It ended up being, the 6 semifinalists ended up being me, Noah, Felice, Dan Chen, Nate Bowen, my eventual opponent, and Jack Aviato. So Kevin Tejan, who finished 11th and would have qualified for the semifinal round because he beat Nate and Jack. But he forgot to check his email. He used an email address that he rarely used and didn't check his email because he thought he didn't advance because he didn't make the top 6 and didn't realize all those other people were ruled ineligible. And a couple years after that, he committed suicide. He also had autism. He was more disabled than I was. Um, he collected disability. He was an amateur magician, among many other sorts of things. And I guess I'm kind of thinking of it because, yeah, it's coming up on the day he died, too. April 19th, 2013. So that's another one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. Kevin's mom, Joyce, wrote a book, Autism, Infidelity, and Loss, I believe it was called, mostly about Kevin and his life, and I decided I wanted to dedicate the book to him. I did not really know him, but he did post in a couple of threads where I had also posted about the Ultimate Typing Championships, so we were certainly aware of each other, even though I didn't know what his name was at the time, and I was shocked to find out he had killed himself later. Yeah, I decided I wanted to dedicate the book to him, as well to Carlo Parisi, who won 2 Intersteno championships and also died of natural causes a couple years later. I talk about a lot of this stuff. I talk about my history with autism and my sensitivities and stuff, and I spend several pages talking about Kevin in one of the chapters as well. But that's one of the places where my mind has been for a while, and I wanted to expand on what I said about wanting to help people with autism. I don't know just what I want to do yet. I know there are things like the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. Maybe I could start a branch here. I did belong to one kind of autism group that was in the Syracuse area, but it was more of a play group where a bunch of autistic people came together and like played with blocks or puzzles or all sorts of games or whatever. And I am perfectly capable of keeping myself entertained. I am never bored anymore. There are so many things that I am interested in that if I get bored with one of my obsessions, I can just easily go on to something else. So what I didn't really need was a play group, but I would have loved in my years of unemployment to have a support group. So that's something I think I want to do at some point. But okay, right now I'm going to get to the quiz. I suppose some people could do identity theft with this, but I mean, my birthday is all over the place anyway. Oh, alright, so just ask for month of birth anyway, but I mean, it's pretty easy to find almost anybody's date of birth on the internet if they're in the United States, because all those people, aggregators where they collect your data without your consent, or you give your consent if you participate on any internet site at all. I mean, you'd have to be extremely security conscious to avoid that happening to you. And now that I'm a public figure and stuff, I mean, people know, so I'm not gonna freak anymore about that. All right, my grandparents. My mom's dad was Irish in origin. My mom's mom was English. My dad's dad was Polish. The name Rona is Polish for crow. Hence my account on TypeRacer S-Crow, which is just S-Rona translated, and a stupid pun. I love stupid puns. And my dad's mom was Irish, so I'm half Irish, half English, half Polish by ethnicity, so I guess I'll put Ireland then. Yes, I have an Asperger's diagnosis. No, I was not ADHD. I think I am probably OCD, but I don't know that. There was a gastroenterologist I went to once who thought I was OCD, but I don't think it was in his purview to diagnose me, so I'll put the middle one there. I don't say I really have social phobia. If I did, it was a few years ago. I've been talking so much I need to drink. Number one, yes, yes, yes. So many times in conversations I feel like I'm going through an algorithm. I have to think about how each person will respond to whatever I say, so I do like this algorithm in my head. If if x equals whatever, which is extremely hard to do with strings, then response y equals, then counter response z equals. For me, conversations too often can be like a game of chess, so then I end up saying nothing, so that's definitely a yes. I'd say that's a yes, but not as strong. I'm good at summarizing, but it can take me a while. I know I once wrote a one-page essay for a high school history class, and it took me 6 hours. So I guess that's kind of a yes, although I can be good at that too. No, I do not feel romance. I have these goofy waves on stream a lot, but I don't feel natural. No, definitely not if I observe the habits of humans more. I'd probably have better social skills. No, I don't like to travel if that's what that means. That might have been metaphorical. Facial expressions, I guess not, although I am getting pretty good at identifying by tone of voice how someone is feeling. When I was a kid, I would have a meltdown when I was stressed. Now I would say I tend to shut down. I mean, that's also connected with depression. Oh, yeah, on the intrusive thoughts. That's why I think OCD is a possibility. Enjoy travel. That's a separate question. All right. Then what does finding your way to new places mean? I guess that must be metaphorical then if it's a different question. I'm still going to say no on both of those. Humidity and air pressure, no. Persecuted, not really. There's a time I might have said yes to that, but not now. Are you sometimes afraid in safe situations? I mean, that's basically everyone in America now because our media trains us to be constantly afraid of shark attacks or crime or killer tornadoes or killer bees or whatever. But not as much as some people. Unfortunately, that's a yes. I don't really hug anyone. I guess I'm unusual by definition. Problems filling out forms. No. Have others told you I had an odd posture or gait? Oh yeah, clearly based on the typing videos where I like do my pretzel thing. Yes, I talk to myself sometimes. I mean, I notice verbal and number patterns, but other kinds of, I'm gonna say strongly agree with that. I don't have romantic interest, period, so very much monotonous voice. I had a history of pacing, yeah. I alternate on that. Sometimes I'm a great self-starter and sometimes I'm lazy, but I think that's everybody. Take messages on the telephone. I mean, nobody does that anymore. An urge to jump over things. Well, I used to run in the halls of high school. Easier than I used to, yeah. Is it important for you to find a unique niche where you can acquire unique competence? Not really, but I did it anyway, so I'll put that. Um, Oh, yes. Always have. These days there's like a certain list of websites I go through and check, which is far too long before I get down to whatever I really should be doing, and I've got to stop that if I want to write anything. Oh yeah, I've talked about my imaginary friends and the nerdity test one. Yeah, I do get songs in my head sometimes. One singular special talent, I had several, but I still think that's a yes. Historically, yes. Currently, no, I'd say. Hmm. That's the first time I've ever tested as not especially autistic. I tested as more autistic than non-autistic, but usually it tells me you are very likely an Aspie. I mean, I've got 150 before, and now I'm down to 112. I have been employed for a few years. I know I'm definitely still autistic, but it's weird that I didn't test as such this time. Neurodiverse talent, I had a score of 10 out of 10, which is related to Asperger's and OCD. Neurotypical talent was also above average, though. Neurodiverse perception average. Alright, I guess that's probably what it is. I'm more chill about things than I used to be. I still think I have intense sensory issues given my um, eating disorder and light sensitivity, so I don't really think that's accurate. I just think that some of these specific questions, bothered by clothes tags, humidity, air pressure, was the specific questions on here that made me not appear Asperger's there, I guess. So maybe this is, I guess this isn't as accurate as it used to be, because I think it was more accurate before. Low score, neurotypical perception. Oh, reading facial expressions, recognizing people. A low score is related to dyspraxia. I got a low score. I forgot what dyspraxia was, though. Okay, lacking coordination for sure. For sure. Neurodiverse communication average. Neurotypical communication. A low score is related to autism spectrum, and I got a low score. Neurodiverse relationships average. Oh, it's because of the asexuality, I guess. Neurodiverse social below average, neurotypical social below average. So, I mean, that definitely seems more autistic. I find this strange. It was the first time the test ever told me that I wasn't autistic, and I don't really believe it. That is the best one, but I was surprised by the result. I mean, yes, I guess I'm socializing more if I'm doing all these videos, and now I'm going to work, and the 150 was at the height of my unemployment, but still, I don't think I stopped being autistic, and I think this asks different questions every time, but I'm puzzled by that. I'll do the other one, the more famous one too, though. Is that still up? Okay. It's so weird that guy is the cousin, I think, of the actor Sacha Baron Cohen. Due to the age of the code powering the calculation required for the test, it no longer works. We are coding a more modern version that will be available shortly. Wonder if the same thing's available elsewhere. Okay, this is the same thing. I'll do it here. I used to notice car number plates a lot, but not as much since my childhood ended. tend to avoid talking a lot when I don't have to. I mean, I prefer nonfiction to fiction, but I wouldn't say I don't like fiction. That's close though. Historically, yes, but no, not this time, no. Or, well, in real life, yes, so I'll put yes. Wouldn't really. Rather, I wouldn't really want to go to either. I think the answer to that used to be yes for me, but now is no. Lately, I am much more interested in whole pictures, like trying to understand trends and stuff in society and culture rather than raw memorization, although I still certainly do like to do that. I mean, nobody uses phone numbers anymore, so that is out of date, or that's more of a 90s skill, I guess. I was good when people had to do it. By internet standards, I might be a good diplomat solely because I'm just not an edgy person, but by real life standards, that might still be a no. I'm great at remembering people's dates of birth, like people in my childhood, but I didn't really try for people more recently. I'm gonna say that's a no now, although it would have been a yes before. 39 out of 50, so I did test autistic according to that. Now, usually I test higher on the other test than I do on this one. I do find that other test is more accurate than this one, but I mean, I don't think it changes my diagnosis or tells me I'm not autistic, but it was surprising that, like, me doing this on recording was the first time that I was sort of judged not autistic, although I don't think it changes. I mean, there are a few things I've just gotten better at. That doesn't mean I stopped being autistic or that it wasn't still affecting me. Clearly it was. And I do still want to help other autistics, and that's what part of this was about. And I do recommend both of those quizzes, the Aspie quiz much more. Um, if you think you might be but kind of fell through the cracks, if you felt socially awkward but there wasn't really a support network for you, I mean, we don't really believe in having support networks here in America much, so rugged individualism is not something autistics are very good at, and considering the high suicide rate among autistics, along with there being a suicide epidemic in the US, it can be rough here for adults with autism, and I want to help people out eventually, and I hope that maybe this video did that. And I'm going to do something less of a downer on the next non-typing day. I'm going to go back and try some of the Zeta Mech math problems, which I did many years ago. And tomorrow I'll have a typing video. Good night.